and maybe speak for 5 minutes on this topic. Now, free software is a software which both the terms are interchangeably used a lot of times, but primarily the difference is that the free software can be used without any consideration being given to the software provider. Open source, on the other hand, shares the source code, and in addition to using the software, it also allows the users to modify and further customize the software. So free softwares might not always give you the source code. They might only give us the binary or the executable file that we can use. Of open software, on the other hand, along with giving the software, they give you all the source code so that we can modify, further improve, or customize the source code based on what our requirement is all about. There are 3 types of licenses which are granted for open source software. One license is called as the permissive license. Now, it's extremely important for us to understand that open source softwares are open source in the sense that they give you all the source codes. Now, what is the derivative work in those source codes? Till what extent can we improve on? What is the level of copyright work that we can include and take onus of? Can we further license commercially the products that we have built on open source software or not? So these are all things that get governed by these 3 types of licenses which are given by the open source software. The first is a permissive license. Permissive license allows the open source software to be incorporated into a software license downstream under closed source terms and in binary form only. So in permissive licenses, only modifications all the modifications can be kept private if desired by the copyright owner. So if the original person who had given the open source software was X and he had given it to a person Y, then Y, if he develops further improved or a modified software using the open source, he can keep the entire source code with himself and only be liable to share the binary, and that is it. Such softwares, examples of such softwares are Apache, BSD, and MIT. There are certain weak copyleft licenses. Then the weak copyleft licenses are those licenses which explicitly permit incorporation of copyleft covered software into a larger binary executable licensed copy under different terms. Now, which is, for example, Mozilla Public License. It is considered as a weak copyleft license because the requirements for modification can be made available in source form under the same license and can be avoided by placing modifications in separate files. So we do not actually have to, the difference between permissive and copyleft is that in copyleft, both these copyleft licenses, we have to share the source codes. There is no doubt. But in the weak copyleft licenses, we need not share the source code along with the software itself. We can keep it alongside and share it in a separate file or to any other separate medium. But in a strong copyleft license, we have to give the complete modified software along with the source code to any further person who would want to further develop and improve on it. And that same person, if he further improves on the same license, he would again have to make sure that he again gives only a strong copyleft license, and he cannot then give a permissive license to another company. What is construed as a derivative work on an open source software? A mere aggregation of an open source software with a closed source software together does not make it fall under the broadest definition of a derivative work. So if there is an original source code that a person or an author has written and he combines it with the open source software, it would not be considered as an open source software again, and therefore it would not be a work of the open source software. Extremely important to see the third point, which says that only those modifications which are made to the open source software would be considered as a derivative work. So only if we use the same open source software as is, and then internally we make more improvements on the same software so that the functionality does not significantly change, then in that case is only when it would be considered as a derivative work. As we discussed, the abstraction, filtration, and comparison test would again be implied here to make sure that what are the components which are original, what are the components that were there in the public domain, what are the components that are always there as part of that platform that we are coding on. And once we identify what the original work is, that work would eventually be compared with the work under contention. This is the last slide that I'll be speaking on. Points to be considered for companies using the open source softwares. While using the open source software in a software that would eventually be commercially licensed, it is extremely important to know the in-licensing obligations. So we have to know whether it is a permissive license, or is it a weak copyleft, or is it a strong copyleft license. We have to understand the definition of the distribution. So every open source software would have a definition for what distribution means, and that distribution clause would talk about what are the ways and the modes in which multiple distributions can be made by the company or who is building and improving or modifying on the same source code. Now, if a software developer combines the open source software in such a way that pieces of the software licensed under different open source licenses would be considered as one large work, then conflicts in the open source licenses may actually prevent the work's distribution in totality. So if the person who's improving or using the open source software and then making his own software using that open source software code, then in that case it could potentially be considered as a derivative work, because largely he's basing the entire algorithm on this open source software that he has, and therefore further licenses cannot be granted in the manner of a permissive license or on a commercially as a proprietary license that companies like Microsoft or Adobe typically give. The last point is also quite self-explanatory. It says that once the open source software is incorporated into a corporation's product and distributed, the corporation is vulnerable to the threat of termination of the OSS license if the terms of OSS are not met. So we have to understand what the terms of the open source license or the open source software are. We have to understand what the distribution clause says. We have to understand what kinds of improvements can be done, to what extent can we add more code to it, and to what extent and try and answer certain questions that we have now.
Yeah, the questions